Good afternoon for those of you on the East Coast, good morning for those on the West Coast, and good evening for those who are in Israel. And thank you all for joining us today. I'm Rachel Brandenburg, Israel Policy Forum's Washington Managing Director and Senior Fellow. I want to welcome those of you who are joining Israel Policy Forum for the first time, as well as our returning viewers. Before we begin our conversation, I want to also thank Israel Policy Forum supporters without whom our work would not be possible. Israel Policy Forum relies on your support to produce free expert analysis and informational content on the most pressing issues affecting Israel and the region and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. If you enjoy Israel Policy Forum's webinars but don't yet know or support the organization's work, please do so by visiting www.israelpolicyforum.org. Over the next hour, I will ask our guests a few questions, but we also welcome audience participation. Please put any questions you have in the chat function, and I will incorporate as many of them as I am able into our conversation. So let's get to our panelists. We have with us today two superb guests who are likely familiar to many of you. My colleague Shira Efron, IPF Research Director and the Diane and Guilford Glazer Foundation Senior Fellow, and Dana Stroul, Director of Research, and Shelly and Michael Kassen Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Dana rejoined the Washington Institute after serving as President Biden's first Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, the Pentagon's top civilian official with responsibility for the Middle East. In that capacity, she led the development and execution of U.S. defense policy in the region during an especially turbulent period that included accelerating integrated air and maritime defense, addressing Iran's destabilizing activities, formulating the U.S. approach to strategic competition, sustaining the Defeat ISIS coalition, and responding to the Israel-Hamas war. Dana had previously been a fellow at the Washington Institute from 2018 to 2020, prior to going to the Department of Defense. Before joining the Washington Institute, Dana served as a senior professional staff member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where she also covered the Middle East, North Africa, and Turkey. Prior to Capitol Hill, she served in the Middle East Policy Office of the Secretary of Defense, where we nearly overlapped from 2008 to 2013. Dana also worked previously at the U.S. Institute of Peace and the National Democratic Institute on Gulf Affairs. Dana, we're really glad to have you with us today. Dr. Shira Efron is familiar to so many of our viewers and listeners, but for those of you who don't know her as well, in addition to her role with IPF, Shira serves as a special climate change advisor to Israel's Ministry of Defense and has spent over 15 years in U.S. think tanks, including the RAND Corporation, where she founded and led the Israel program between 2016 to 2022, the Center for American Progress, the Middle East Institute, and the Institute for National Security Studies. She was previously a consultant to the UN country team in Jerusalem and has a PhD and MPhil in policy analysis from Rand's Graduate School, an MA in International and Relations and International Business from New York University, and a BSc in Biology and Computer Science from Tel Aviv University. I'm honored to have both of you on this panel today and really looking forward to what I have no doubt will be a timely and valuable conversation about, as we were just saying amongst ourselves, what continues to be a very dynamic and still evolving situation. So let's get started. After 12 days of war between Israel and Iran, which the U.S. entered when it launched strikes on Iran last weekend, a ceasefire took hold on Tuesday morning, and thus far seems to be sustained. What exactly was achieved through strikes on Iran's nuclear program and U.S. strikes on Iran's nuclear program has yet to be confirmed. We've seen competing assessments from the U.S. and Israel over the past 12 or so hours, so we await further and more verifiable information. We're also waiting to see what happens next. What happens next with respect to diplomacy and bringing Iran back to the negotiating table? Or given President Trump's very recent remarks at NATO earlier today, whether the U.S. is even going to try to bring Iran back to the negotiating table, and if so, over what? So I want to talk this afternoon about what we've seen and where the parties, particularly the U.S. and Israel and some of our regional partners, are in this moment, as well as where you think we might see things going from here. So Shira, I'm going to start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about the mood in Israel right now? What do you make of the Israeli decision to cease fire earlier this week? And was Israel able to accomplish enough militarily over this war that they would be willing to let Trump or others bring the parties back to the negotiating table?
Hi, Rachel. Hi, Dana. It's so good to be here with both of you. And I really look forward to hearing what Dana has to say on this. Um, as you said in your opening remarks, Rachel, I think there are some disagreements and quabbles about what was achieved in terms of militarily, in terms of assessments on the three nuclear sites, the Fordo, Natanz, Isfahan. Um, the ballistic missiles infrastructure facilities, the heads of different branches of the Iranian security forces. We talk about IRGC and others, and of course the nuclear scientists. Um, but in terms of the sense in Israel, and this is sort of the public line, that the performance and the achievements, the military achievements, have exceeded expectations with fairly minimal casualties and damages relatively to what was expected under different scenarios. So in terms of Israel, and if you think about it and sort of knock on wood, right? But none of the Israeli Air Force pilots was in harm's way. There was no risk. I mean, this is an actual old school war. It's not fighting a terrorist organization like Israel has been doing in previous years, and still this is considered a major success. Um, in terms of, and I'm sure Dana will talk about it, but we're hearing different assessments also in the United States, right? In terms of the damages to actually, the main discussion is about Fordo. There is a more nuanced discussion in Israel when we're talking about, okay, we can talk about the specific facilities, but there's a main concern about the level, the uranium that's left in Iran. There's a lot of talk about the 408 kilograms of enriched uranium to 60%, and how much of it is left and how much of it was taken away by the Iranians. But Iran has farther larger quantities of uranium that's enriched to the 20% level, to the 3 to 5% level, that they can easily enrich to 90%, assuming they have centrifuges, which they probably do have. And it's also not that difficult to build new centrifuges, right? Like this with all the major achievements, Israel, and then with the final blow by the United States, has not turned into removed all the nuclear literacy from Iran. It's not a nuclear ignorant country after investing for 25 years. And the real question is, does this has this campaign changed Iran's calculations? Because they can choose politically to go the sort of North Korean route, right? And to go for decide to go for a nuclear weapon, because had they had a nuclear weapon, no one would have dared to strike them. So I think the challenge of where we are now is how to bring them to the agreement. I will just say, in terms of the Israeli calculations, so many of us, and especially because of the war in Gaza being dragged for so long, there were fears in Israel that the Israeli decision makers will become a little bit, how should I say, greedy, in terms of, oh, there are more strikes we want to do, we can achieve more, let's go for regime change. And I really welcome the decision to take the win and stop on time. And once you've actually achieved what are achievable goals, and I'm sure we will talk about in Gaza, where there's quite a big contrast between the achievable goals, stop on time. So it's true that Israel was conveniently forced by Trump. But what I'm hearing is also that the defense establishment, at least, they knew that as every day that goes by, the marginal utility sort of this, if this campaign was eroding and the risk was increasing, plus enormous cost to the Israeli economy, and lives were lost here, right? And damages. Just a few anecdotes on this, because I think President Trump says things and then he says different things. So he's going to meet the Iranians. They're going to be an agreement. I don't know, but I think it's really interesting for Israelis. Numbers of soldiers and numbers of aircraft and the numbers of sorties. This is like highly classified information. And all of a sudden we hear the president saying that there are Israeli forces on the ground in Fordo have verified the damages. And I don't know if there are Israeli commando on the ground in Fordo, but if there are, speaking about them publicly risk their lives. He spoke about 52 aircraft, fighter aircraft that he actually ordered to turn around and not perform strikes after the ceasefire came into effect. This is information that Israelis would never hear from the Israeli Authority. And the final thing, I think, is that the Israeli Atomic Commission, which I don't know, Dana, Rachel, you've been working in this field for a long time. They never issue any statement. No one knows works there who talks, and all of a sudden they issue a statement, which was probably forced by Trump. So I think there's an interesting dynamic here in terms of the president of the United States informing the world, the Israelis, but also Israel's adversaries of what Israel is doing, and also basically, I don't want to say, I'm not even sure if it's forcing, but pressuring Israel to issue statements that confirm what he wants to say. And this is unique. So
For sure. Thank you. And I'll come back to the US-Israel dynamic here, as well as you mentioned Gaza. First, I want to turn to Dana. What are you thinking about from the US perspective?
Well, first of all, pleasure to be with you both, and really welcome this opportunity, especially through the IPF platform. So I want to just add some of what I see from the US dynamic to what Shira laid out in her remarks. First of all, on this issue of the intelligence and the assessments of what the military campaigns accomplish, there's a few different issues that I think, at least in some of the hysteria of the media coverage of this, are getting lost. So first of all, on this issue of the US intelligence assessment, it's hard for me to comment on the actual validity of the assessment because I haven't seen it. All we are talking about are some leaked versions of a report by the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is one of 18 different US intelligence agencies. And in the US system, when all the agencies get together and have a consolidated consensus view, it's represented at our highest level, so the Director of National Intelligence. So when the DNI, Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, goes and presents a view to Congress, that means that all of the US intelligence agencies have agreed on a certain bottom line assessment. In the case of what's being discussed here in the United States, it's one agency in an initial assessment that apparently is classified as low confidence. And in the US system, we have things at low, moderate, and high confidence. So this is an initial sketch only of what the US military strikes on 3 facilities did or did not accomplish. What it is not is a comprehensive or holistic view of everything that was done to Iran's nuclear infrastructure since the beginning of the Israeli campaign. And I think you're hearing this focus on just the DIA assessment, and it is at risk for misrepresenting exactly what's happened here. So the bottom line is we don't know yet, but when you in totality look at the damage to these 3 nuclear sites from the US strikes, plus Israeli operations against nuclear scientists, plus the military industrial complex of Iran, plus air defense, plus missile launchers, it's a really significant operation. Now, I think another area where a lot of the public commentary is confusing was this a good operation? What did we accomplish? Did we achieve? What did we achieve? Everything we wanted to achieve? There is a difference between operational achievements and strategic achievements. And I think it's worth reflecting on that because I think there is imperatives or impetus on both sides, both in Israel and the United States, to conflate the two, and it's important to disaggregate them. So operationally, what Israel accomplished and then essentially paved the way for the United States to join in with minimal risk to our Air Force is remarkable from an operational perspective. The reasons to not strike inside Iran over all the years and the past 5 presidential administrations here in Washington has been Iranian air defense, Iranian ability to retaliate with their missile program and rain down fury on Israel, on the region, on U.S. forces, on U.S. bases. The Iranian threat network activating in response to defend the regime inside Iran and either raining down too many rockets and activating as threats against Israel or against U.S. forces. So where we are in that the IDF was able to do this at this point in time is because of this remarkable operational achievements over since October 7th. So after nearly 2 years, plus a lowering of the fear barrier that military strikes could be undertaken inside Iran without activating to, some people say full-scale war, regional conflagration, World War III, whatever it is. The assessment is what we just saw could have been much worse. And I think that's a fair assessment. But no military operation on its own was going to eliminate Iran's nuclear program. And that's where we get to what the strategic achievement is. And I think one of the things that really needs to be analyzed in the coming days and weeks is the timing of Israel's operation. Because it is true that Washington was about to go into another round of nuclear talks with the Iranians indirectly in Oman. And clearly there was concern that the trajectory of those talks were not going to deliver a full blocking of all paths for Iran to develop a nuclear weapon. And that at this point, and especially I think in a post-October 7th strategic environment, was a risk that the leadership of Israel was not willing to take. And so the question now, after what Israel did in 12 days and what the United States did in one night, does it change the negotiating environment on the other side of these military operations in a way where we can actually get an agreement that verifiably to the whole world prevents Iran from ever having a decision in the future to develop a nuclear weapon? And we just don't know. We don't have an answer to that. There's been a couple of things said by President Trump at NATO, including, I don't think an agreement is necessary. We don't need to negotiate because they obliterated their program. We obliterated their program. The bottom line is the regime is still there. And I don't think that a regime that invested decades and so much national treasure and resources in this program was going to just abandon the whole thing after less than 2 weeks of Israeli operations and one night of US operations. And so the question I think before us now is, how do you utilize the leverage of the military operational achievements to get to that strategic effect, which is a verifiable arrangement in which we know that Iran will never be able to pursue a nuclear weapon now for the rest of the Trump administration, but really all the way into the future. And finally, another area that I think requires further attention at this point in time is the parameters of the ceasefire. So this is, I'm going to just build on what Shira said and say this is a unique and abnormal policy environment. So that the President of the United States announces a ceasefire that Israel and Iran agree to, but clearly didn't have enough advanced warning of the ceasefire that the Iranians had already shot off some ballistic missiles aimed at Israel, is abnormal. The fact that there is no further details about the parameters of the ceasefire, that nothing is written down, that we don't know who is actually in charge of monitoring or enforcing the ceasefire, who will decide when one side or the other side has cheated or violated. And as we all know, the Iranians have excelled over decades at playing in the gray space and exploiting ambiguities in agreements, which is why the original Iran nuclear agreement was so airtight and took so long to negotiate, because every single technical area is one where the Iranians saw an opportunity to cheat, obfuscate, or exploit. So this is a vague ceasefire. And the idea that the President of the United States has positioned himself in an area where he's going to be the arbiter of who's cheating and who needs to stop what, again, is pretty abnormal and very risky. And finally, just to build on another thing that Shira said, it's obviously quite abnormal for any US president to essentially position oneself in opposition to your own intelligence community and then just deliver an assessment of a foreign government's intelligence to the world. Part of the challenge here that I think is going to be critical going forward is that with respect to the Israeli decision to initiate its military operations and the United States decision to initiate its military operations, we need to understand exactly what changed in the intelligence assessment. why there was a view that continuing with the negotiations was not going to deliver the certainty that Israel needed, the United States needed, or the world deserves about Iran's nuclear ambitions. Just presenting this assessment without details and frankly without briefing Congress here in the United States, again, is quite abnormal.
Thanks, Dana. That was a really helpful overview and explanation and analysis. I have a bunch of follow-up questions, but I want to stay on the negotiation environment. And for you and then for Shira, do you think the war has had an impact, and U.S. involvement, President Trump showing that he was willing to strike and all that went into that, does that have any bearing on the U.S. position as a negotiator? Does it give negotiations a better chance of getting to a better place? And then I'll let Dana answer first, but Shira, for you, does this give Prime Minister Netanyahu more breathing space to let negotiations proceed and see where they could lead?
Well, first of all, I think what is clear from the experience of the last 12, I guess now we're 14 days after the initiation of Israel's operations, is that the United States remains indispensable in the region. And it's only the United States that could have brokered the ceasefire. It's only the United States that has the military capabilities that it just displayed to the whole world. Without question, the operations of the IDF have been exceptional. What they have displayed not only in the past 2 weeks, but really since October 7th. But only the United States has the munitions that were just used in Iran. Only the United States could fly 40 hours round trip from inside the continental United States, do those operations and safely fly back. Only the United States has the ability to project power as quickly as it has into the Middle East. 2 aircraft carriers, fighter squadrons, naval destroyers, additional air defense, plus supporting Israel defensively with our ballistic missile destroyers, in addition to what Israel has, plus supporting Qatar's defense after Iran fired ballistic missiles at Qatar. It's only the United States. I do acknowledge the debates right now that because the United States had said it was committed to diplomacy, didn't actually explain why it determined that diplomacy was at a dead end or an impasse and then reverted to offensive strikes in Iran, undermines its ability to be a main negotiator on Iran's nuclear program. But the reality is that absent the United States at the table, I don't think these talks are going to get anywhere anyway. And I think if you're Iran or Tehran, the regime, you're looking out at the region, what you experienced over the past couple of weeks is there is not one government that came to your defense. Not even Russia or China paid some rhetorical lip service to decrying the aggression of Israel and the United States, but no one said, yep, now's the time we think it's okay for Iran to have a nuclear weapon. And in the middle of Israel's operations, Trump goes to Canada to the G7, and the G7 doesn't condemn Israel. The G7 statement actually says Iran is the driver of instability in the region, and we all agree that Iran can never have a nuclear weapon. I think we have to see what comes out of the NATO summit today. But the bottom line is, for all the different governments that might have said we condemn this kind of aggression, nobody actually came to Iran's defense in a meaningful way. And then you look at Iran's threat network, Hezbollah, Hamas, the militias, the Houthis in Yemen, they all took a knee too. There were some rhetorical, menacing, and threatening statements, but nobody within 24 hours of Israel strikes or the U.S. strikes actually said, okay, now we're going to activate against U.S. forces, U.S. bases, or Israel. They all took a knee. And so if you're the regime looking out at this, I think you understand that no one's going to come to your defense on this. The world has been unmoved in its commitment to you not getting a nuclear weapon, and your capabilities are significantly set back. So is now the time to be more flexible at the negotiating table. And that is, I think the major challenge going forward.
Thank you. Your point about all the other proxies and countries sort of taking a knee or remaining quiet has really been remarkable if you think about where things were 2 years ago and how much the region has shifted. And I want to come back to how do we turn these sort of tactical victories in a more sustainable strategic shift. But Shira, first over to you.
Yeah, so I'll build on what Dana said, because I wanted to note when you asked about sort of what Israel has achieved, and right, the focus is so much on the ballistic missiles, launchers, and the nuclear sites, but there are other achievements, right? Israel, this was an Israeli way of showing that Sinwar's decision to launch the October 7th attack, with the goal of bringing sort of all the Iranian proxy network. And right, it was his decision. It wasn't ordered by Tehran, but there's this idea of a proxy network that will circle Israel with a ring of fire. You know, the famous plan didn't work, and you know, we don't know because thank goodness he's dead. But I'm not sure that if you ask Sinwar, you know, your actions, then this would be the outcome almost 2 years afterwards. Not sure it's worth the bet. And I think for Israelis, this idea that, you know, starting a war with Israel is not the right decision. And this is something that, you know, for Israelis, if I look back, and this is, we're definitely not out of the black hole here. I'm sure we'll get to Gaza and the West Bank and other fronts, but for Israelis, the sense of, you know, that our basic security was appended 627 years ago. This is, you know, this is important to show that you have a military that's actually very capable, restoring deterrence, demonstrating to Iran that, right, maybe it hasn't accomplished everything, but the immense Israeli intelligence penetration into Iran's depth, I mean, it's pretty remarkable. I would think if I'm, you know, in the Iranian government, I would fear that anyone next to me is a Mossad agent, and I think this is scary. And I think Dana's point about the fact that, you know, China and Russia and there's polemics and stuff, but no one actually did anything. We'll see how Trump comes back from NATO. There are a lot of platitudes, a lot of flattery, right, going back there. But it is interesting that he seemed to be on board, and the Europeans want an agreement. They want negotiations, and the language also turned. I got to tell you that 30 days ago, when Israelis were talking about zero enrichment, I would say, of course not. Why would Iran agree to this? But now you hear zero enrichment from others. So I think this is also an Israeli achievement, right? The demands have changed. The legacy now, it's because of, you know, the IAEA, the Board of Governors, Vienna snapback. But there's something that I think, in a sense, Israel, it's not just a military achievement. Israel got diplomatic cover for its actions, not just from the Americans. And it's not only because of Israel, it's because Iran is Iran. And, you know, it annoyed a lot of countries, right? It used to be able to go to the Europeans. If you heard Brits, they were more angry with the Iranians than even the Americans in the last couple of years. So this is where we are on this. In terms of Netanyahu, where he is on an agreement, it really depends on what's in the agreement. But I think, first of all, Netanyahu is, there's a really sense of pride. Some people will say hubris on the side of the Israeli political leadership after this operation now. And if he's forced or urged to sign on to an agreement by the United States, I don't think Israel is going to be in any position to say no. Now, the thing is that, and Dana started speaking about before, which is a really important point, we have sort of a ceasefire, and I think in Trump's mindset, this is a deal, right? He's a deal maker, but we don't know the terms. I don't know if there's anything written or verbal, and we don't know the enforcement mechanism. Now, the assumption in Israel and the model that a lot of people in the defense establishment are talking about is, we'll do Lebanon. You know, we will just, every time we'll see a violation, we will attack. But there are technical and political differences. First of all, Lebanon is right here. You can't just, like, every Sunday and Wednesday to fly all the way to Tehran and strike there and assume that they will not retaliate. There's a lot of airspace to cover of different countries where you need the US to support this. Iran will respond. And in Lebanon, it's a very different thing. There is some sort of an agreement. There is a side letter, or a language about a side letter. Dana may have seen the side letter. But also there is an organization. Israel had a fight with Hezbollah. And on top of Hezbollah, there's a Lebanese government. And there's a coordination mechanism and a deconfliction mechanism. Iran, this is the government, and this is still the regime. So how does it actually work? Can Israel sustain this? Can Israel sustain this with munitions, with interceptors? On all of these things, I think the US has, you know, US is necessary, both to enable, but also to tell Israel what it can do and what it cannot do. And also, frankly, it's not in Israeli interest to do that, right? To have a mechanism sort of like, so I think this Lebanon example is revoked, but without actually thinking about the details. And then the question is what comes in the agreement. But Netanyahu is, in the polling, we don't see that he's sort of like block changes if he runs to election today. But in terms of suitability to be a prime minister, his Likud party is gaining a little bit. Maybe it's not substantial. You know, the Israeli political system, we can't predict anything until there's actually elections. But he's definitely in a position now to make decisions about Iran with no opposition, not internal opposition and not external opposition. And so if I agree with Dana wholeheartedly, if we can come to an agreement that actually sort of anchors this military achievement with a strategic one, Israel should be on board.
Thanks, Shira. I want to zoom out a little bit to the rest of the region. The U.S. certainly is able to try and push Israel around, but particularly some of the Gulf partners and other regional actors have been more involved, whether behind the scenes or overtly, in things like a regional defense architecture. Dana, something that you're very familiar with. And there's all this talk about a way forward. Does this open up any space for not Saudi-Israel normalization anytime soon necessarily, but for sort of turning some of the tactical gains that we've all talked about into more strategic wins for Israel's position in the region, for U.S. policy toward the region? Dana, I'll turn to you for thoughts.
So the past few years, in my view, we've seen a remarkable shift in the leadership of countries within the region. So a few points here. First, the Middle East is almost some days like a split screen. Think about President Trump's trip to the Middle East, to Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar. Investments, artificial intelligence, big deals. Think about even when President Biden went to Saudi Arabia in 2022, the Jeddah communique was actually all about cooperation with the countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council, not in the Middle East, but globally. Renewable energy, food security, emerging technology, some of the ways in which Israel's economy and knowledge sector, IT, AI, are so advanced is this is the Gulf is very interested in learning about the Israeli culture, the startup nation, and trying to get some of that ethos into their societies and into their economies. So in that context, one of I think a really remarkable shift in recent years is Gulf leadership and mediation of regional issues. A few examples. Saudi Arabia taking a major role in Syria in facilitating the Trump-Shara meeting, the new leader in Damascus post Bashar al-Assad, and Saudi Arabia actually saying we're going to work to forgive Syria's debt to international financial institutions. Qatar leadership, which of course is a very controversial issue in Israel, but Qatar saying we're going to pay the civil servant salaries in Syria. We're going to continue to fund the Lebanese armed forces, which is actually something we need right now as we have a enforcement of the ceasefire and actually keep pressure on the Lebanese armed forces to go and look at different caches of Hezbollah weapons and activities. Oman has been the mediator between the United States and Iran. I could go on in all the ways in which, and we should of course talk about the UAE here, who has played a critical role in liaising with Israelis, mostly behind the scenes, about what day after planning in Gaza could look like. All of these countries are now positioning their leadership and their ministries of foreign affairs to work on de-escalation, stabilization, resolving some of the structural reasons that the Middle East has been so unstable. And then at the same time, we've seen some remarkable cases of security cooperation. So of course, the best proof of concept here was the Multilateral Air Defense Coalition last April, when Iran launches ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and attack drones at Israel. And the United States organized, with Israeli participation and cooperation, Arab military and European military, an unprecedented coalition to defeat all the cruise missiles and drones so that Israel only had to focus on the ballistic missiles. So we can actually see that multilateral cooperation, intelligence sharing, early warning sharing, buying the same kinds of systems, exercising with each other, meeting with each other, saves lives. Proof of concept, check. And we've actually seen a desire and an appetite from the leaders of these governments to be involved in resolving conflicts, the drivers of instability, and empowering leaders that can offer something better than what Iran dominating these regional governments looks like. So for the first time, you have leadership in Beirut that's actually saying the right things. We have a leader in Damascus who says, yeah, I could see normalization with Israel by the end of the Trump administration. This is tectonic, totally seismic change in the possibilities in the strategic environment, many of which could be resoundingly important for Israel's long-term security. And so the challenge for Israel, I'm going to definitely defer to Shira on the politics of Israel and whether or not Netanyahu and his governing coalition has more or less negotiating space at this point in time. But the challenge for Israel is whether or not they can seize on and translate the military successes of the IDF over the past nearly 2 years into strategic and political outcomes. And that's not something that the IDF can do for Israel. It's going to have to be the political leadership. And so I can already see bubbling up here in Washington questions of, has Netanyahu achieved enough in restoring Israel's deterrence, making it quite clear that Israel will no longer hesitate to use military force to defend its interests? Is now the time that he can finally move forward on Gaza? But it's going to be more than that. Normalization with Saudi Arabia is still a possibility. Normalization with Lebanon and Syria is actually a possibility, possibly even more so than Saudi Arabia in the near term. That will take adjustments and policies from Jerusalem. And I think the big question is whether or not he feels that he has the political space to do some of that policy adjustment now.
Thanks, Dana. You have perfectly teed up what was going to be my next question. I will just say, I think for all three of us, having worked on these issues for the past couple of decades, to see everything that you've just described come to fruition in the most unfortunate of circumstances to have to be tested. But all of these different ways that the US has been nudging parties, that parties have sort of been evolving themselves, countries, non-state actors, and sort of see where we've ended up does feel like a moment of opportunity from a geopolitical standpoint and success from a military standpoint. So Shira, how much does Israel appreciate some of these shifts and the potential? What chance is there that Netanyahu is able to take some political risks and move towards some of the opportunities that Dana described?
I wish I knew what Netanyahu is likely to do or not do. I'll just want to add, there is a mindset in Israel, this idea that Trump coined the term peace through strength, and Netanyahu is using it also. And I've heard it from people around, Ron Dermer, is that that now that the regional partners have seen Israel's abilities, they're going to knock on Israel's door for normalizing ties. And I'm just a little bit more skeptical because I think Dana mentioned, and there's so much that's happening in terms of regional integration and cooperation behind the scenes. And for them to take the risk of sort of coming out of the closet, right? And even like stepping up their relationship with Israel at a time like this, without addressing this minor issue, which we avoided touching until now, the Palestinian issue, when those images from Gaza are still on TV all the time, except for in Israel, but not just on Al Jazeera, right? Also on CNN and others, the pictures from Gaza. When the West Bank is also, some parts of it look like Gaza. When there's undermining of the Palestinian Authority. When Saudi Foreign Minister Rahman was supposed to lead a delegation of foreign ministers to come visit Ramallah, the Palestinian Authority, a few days before the campaign started, and Israel blocked his visit and didn't let him come. I just don't see this happening at the moment, despite Israel's incredible military achievement. And I agree with Dana, the door is open. But I think that without changing the policy on this, it's going to be very difficult. When we're talking about Lebanon and Syria, there's great appreciation. I think Tzachi Hanegbi, the head of the Israeli National Security Council, said today that there are daily contacts with the Syrians. By the way, Rachel, we were talking about this. I had an article about this. This was not the situation a couple of months ago. There's a total shift in Israeli mindset. But, when you ask some Syrians, as I did today, this is great. They say, yeah, of course, but we will want to negotiate the Golan Heights, and Israel will have to leave our territory. Lebanon also. It involves Israeli changing their policy approach and changing the whole way we've been acting after October 7, which is all these buffer zones in other countries' territories. And I'm old school, I believe in sovereignty. It turns out that these countries also believe in sovereignty. So I think it might be a little bit difficult, but the Palestinian is really the issue that unless we find some sort of a solution, I think for Gaza, and it can't be just Gaza, right? When I talk to Dana, for sure, but when we talk to the Saudis and Emiratis and others, say we need something on the Palestinian that's more meaningful. So it's not just like a temporary ceasefire in Gaza. No, it has to be changing the equation in Gaza, ending the war, and then having, and we've spoken about it so many times, right? This is a transitional civilian government, technocratic government in Gaza, which will have some sort of dotted line to the Palestinian Authority, supported by the Arab governments, and at one point bringing the PA, when it's reformed, to preside over both Gaza and the West Bank with some sort of political horizon to the Palestinians. It's not a state. No one's talking about a state anymore now, but it's some gradual partition rather than gradual annexation, as we're seeing at the moment. I don't think the Arabs are going to come save Israel, right? Israelis, when you ask in polls, what's your likely option? What's your favorable option for Gaza? The highest option is for the United Arab Emirates to manage it. I mean, fine. Yeah, I want many things too. I just, this is not, I don't know why it appears in every Israeli poll. So the Arabs are there. The door is open for integrating Israel into the region, for helping Israel with the Palestinians in ways that we haven't seen before. We spoke about the Gulf countries. Jordan intercepted missiles from Iran yesterday or the day before. There were sirens in Jordan. There are interceptors in Egypt. I mean, at the end of the day, these agreements really matter. And talking about Netanyahu, I think very rarely a leader has such a winning card deck. Okay? He can do anything now. The excuse has always been that Ben Gvir and Smotrich would leave his coalition. You look at polling, they may not even pass the threshold to be elected next time. I don't think that after this, heroic operation in Iran, they will leave the coalition. And even if they do, he will have a safety net by Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid and others. The door is open, from fixing the sort of Philadelphia corridor in Gaza to Riyadh. And whether he's going to take it, I don't know. I hope so. So far, and maybe I'll just end with this, we are hearing optimism from President Trump also, and from Witkoff, about negotiations in Qatar, about end of the war in Gaza. This is very far from what we're seeing from Israelis today. They're saying they're not sending a delegation, not to Egypt, not even sending a delegation, and they're continuing to talk about the Witkoff model, which is a gradual, piecemeal agreement without ending the war. So yes, this is the right time to do everything, and there is a discussion in Israel that is also we haven't heard in the last few months, right? What are we doing there? All of a sudden today, I think it's sort of the dissonance coming from this Iran operation to 7 more IDF soldiers killed in Gaza yesterday, 19 from the beginning of the month, with no clear achievements or any direction. And people are asking, what do we do this? So if the question is, can Netanyahu do it? Sure. Will he do it? I don't know.
I want to ask one more question on Gaza, and then I'll turn to Dana. You mentioned the 7 soldiers killed last night, this morning, or at least announced this morning. As the world has mostly been focused on Iran, foreign media, I know from here you sort of can forget that Gaza, there's still a war ongoing. Can you say a word about what's actually been happening there? What is this situation in Gaza? We've gotten a couple of questions about it from audience members.
Yeah. So Israelis forgot to about Gaza, despite soldiers dying there. So there are different reports in terms of what percentage of Gaza Israel occupies and doesn't occupy. The fact is there's been dwindling of forces because Israel had to, we had to move forces to the border with Jordan and the West Bank and other areas of risk, fearing Iranian retaliation through different militias. So there's actually very little fighting that is actively happening. And you see all the soldiers are being killed are from RPGs and cornets and IEDs, but there's actually little sort of active fighting. It's very slow Israeli operations in areas where the ground forces have worked before. It's the same. It's very small, it's 141 square miles. It's not Iran. So, if you look at the strikes, there are forces that we've seen actually in the last few weeks. The numbers I'm seeing are very, very high, of close to 800,000 Palestinians back in the northern part of Gaza, which is what Israel has tried to move everyone to the south. Hamas is a shell of what it used to be, right? In terms of who's the leadership there and who do we even talk to? But in terms of Israel's goals is dismantling Hamas. And I don't know what does it mean. Does every 16-year-old that signed on to Hamas and puts on a green ribbon, this is how we judge if we achieved our objectives or not. There's a humanitarian situation that I know my Israeli friends are really upset when I say this, but it's horrendous all over Gaza. We're talking about over 90% of displacement, shortage of basically everything. There are very unique challenges in Gaza which explain that, right? It's different from other humanitarian sort of war zones around the world, but the situation is that you have the population is in a zombie state, just in survival mode, also. And I think we're in a moment of decision, right? If Israel wants to say, okay, listen, we have decided we have to occupy Gaza and institute a military rule because this is what we believe is effective, do it. Or tell the Israeli public and let the Israeli public decide if that's what they want to do and be in Gaza now for 20, 30 years. But otherwise, we have to get out of there. What we've been seeing also since the last time we spoke, we're seeing more of a Somali-like approach, arming of local groups, and these are local militias, to help with protecting humanitarian assistance. I really fear those risks. I understand it doesn't have to be either Hamas or that. There could be another way, but it's complicated and it involves a lot of risks. But this is sort of where we are in the fighting. We'd probably have a whole conversation about where we are in Gaza, but I guess I'm a little bit encouraged by the fact that the Israeli public sentiment, which was not there a couple of months ago, to say what we can't leave and Hamas and we haven't achieved it. People are asking, what are we doing there? And it's a good question.
Thanks, Shira. Dana, I'm going to turn back to you. Go ahead.
So I think a lot of what Shira said about where the IDF, where the Israeli government goes in Gaza is really critical. And one implication of the US stepping into Israel's campaign in the past couple weeks, I think that there will be implications for maybe not the US-Israel relationship, but the Trump-Netanyahu relationship. And there is certainly a risk of conflating the two, at least here in the United States. So what we've actually seen, I think, since the beginning of Trump's second administration is very up and down, hot and cold between Trump and Netanyahu. So think about the beginning of the administration, the Netanyahu getting the first meeting in the Oval Office, the kind of unity and what we saw there, to Netanyahu being very surprised that Trump said, and according to public reporting, no to military strikes in Iran. I want to try negotiations. Then actually not exempting Israel from tariffs and the trade war that the Trump administration initiated. Then to clearly Israel and Netanyahu being very surprised by President Trump's decision to provide sanctions relief to Syria without actually much time at all of demonstrated behavior change in ways that we would want. So we've seen Damascus in this new transitional leadership take important steps. Generally, since I've said this is an abnormal and unique policy environment, normally you would see metered out sanctions relief in exchange for demonstrated commitment to counterterrorism, countering Iran's networks, countering narcotics, securing the chemical weapons, taking specific actions to ensure that Israel's security is upheld, these sorts of things. That's not what happened. Trump just said, okay, like I'm going all in on you and I will give you sanctions relief. And clearly the Israelis were taken by surprise. Then we're now at another high. We were at another high, I should say, in terms of his full backing of Israel's military campaign in Iran, and then his decision to enter and have the U.S. execute offensive strikes only 36 hours later to actually publicly suggest equivalency between Israel and Iran when it came to the ceasefire, when it came to what they were fighting about, and to publicly put more pressure on Netanyahu and the IDF than Iran in terms of adhering to backing off in terms of the ceasefire. All that to say, I think there was a moment of opportunity between the United States and Israel because objectives aligned when it came to Iran at this moment in time. But I think it's really important to remember what Trump likely heard on his trip in the Middle East. What he heard from leaders in the Gulf is, we do not want any more war. We do not want you to strike Iran. War is bad for business, bad for our economies. For Saudi Arabia, it's terrible for Vision 2030, the predictability and the stability that these governments need to stabilize, to de-escalate, to turn away from war, to grow their economies, to respond to what their very young populations want from their governments. And if Gaza goes longer, it already has gone on very, very long, the risk is that the tension between people and governments in the Middle East, the very governments that actually are ready to think about normalizing with Israel, and very much what Trump wants is to facilitate normalization between these governments and these countries and Israel. If it becomes the view that it's the Israeli government's resistance or it's Netanyahu's resistance to taking certain actions that is the impediment to moving forward in ways that could be more stabilizing for the region, then I think it's quite clear that Trump will not hesitate at all to call out Netanyahu and pressure him. And he had already expressed concerns about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. And so what's just happened for the past 2 weeks is the world hasn't really focused on the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. The world isn't focused on starving Palestinian kids. But now that the news is not going to be dominated by the war in Iran, I think it's reasonable to anticipate that it turns right back there. And what we know is that Trump is watching TV 24/7. And if he looks at it and it appears to him that Israel is not taking the right steps to wind this down, when he's delivered so many things for Israel to actually enable long-term security, he's likely to get really frustrated. And whether or not that just becomes tension between Trump and Netanyahu, or it risks bigger tension between the United States and Israel, especially when there's actually criticism here in this country right now on both the right and the left over the wisdom of this operation in Iran. All of this could conflate in ways that are very harmful to Israel and to the U.S.-Israel relationship.
I want to pull the thread. Thank you for that. I want to pull the thread on the U.S.-Israel relationship. I appreciate the distinction you made between the Trump-Netanyahu relationship and U.S.-Israel. So there's been so much hand-wringing over the past more than year, but couple years over where is the U.S.-Israel relationship? Is it under threat? There was prediction that because of President Trump, it would be better than ever. And I think some have been disappointed for the whole trajectory you laid out. Where do you see the U.S.-Israel relationship? And if I can ask you to in there talk about the MOU that will come to a close soon, the 10-year MOU between Israel and the U.S.
Right. So there's been 2 10-year memoranda of understanding MOUs, which have provided the framework for the billions of dollars in military assistance that the United States has provided to Israel, and separately missile defense funding. So clearly we've seen over the past 2 years, and certainly in the past 2 weeks, that missile defense funding saves lives and enables Israel to have an entirely different calculation of how it keeps its people, Israeli citizens, and the tens of thousands of American citizens living in Israel safe while it addresses its security, the threat environment abroad. That MOU, the current one, will expire in 2028, but really negotiations have to start soon because it typically takes more than a year. You'd want to finish the negotiation and lock it in time for Congress to have time to plan in its budget and the State Department budget for that security assistance. So negotiations need to kick off here super soon. And I think it's also important to recall that outside of the MOU, there's been 2 emergency supplementals that Congress has passed on a bipartisan basis for Israel only in the past couple years. So after the 2021 Operation Guardian of the Walls, Congress passed a $1 billion supplemental at the request of the Biden administration to replenish and expand the Israel Iron Dome system. And then in the summer of last year, there was, I believe, a $14 billion, Rachel, nod at me if I got that correct, $14 billion, in emergency funding, not only directly for Israel, but also for U.S. forces and the U.S. military taking on more activities and posture in the Middle East to support Israel's ability to defend itself. So what we've seen in terms of missile interceptor expenditures, what the U.S. military just did with the massive ordnance penetrators, the MOPS, the aircraft, the Tomahawk missiles coming out of submarines, all of these things cost money. And there will certainly be a debate and a request from the administration for emergency funding. So that is sort of on the agenda coming up. I think that probably emergency assistance to support replenishing Israel's missile interceptors for its air defense comes up before the big strategic conversation about the next 10-year MOU, Memorandum of Understanding for Security Assistance. But in that environment, one issue that I think will come up is the fact that there is now criticism of this relationship on both the left and the right. So we've seen members on the Democratic side introduce resolutions of disapproval on specific arms sales to Israel. We saw last year members on the Democratic side try to slow down security assistance to Israel based on a view that Israel was in violation of its obligations under humanitarian law and then under US law. And on the right, we've seen some criticism of the United States entering into a war and a view here that the United States entering into this war in Iran was on behalf of Israel, as opposed to doing it for its own security interests. So it's unclear to me exactly how all of this plays out in time and space, but broadly speaking, what has always been a bedrock, foundational element of the U.S.-Israel relationship is that it has been broadly bipartisan. And the more you hear criticism on the right and the left, I think the fact that there are going to be debates about whether Israel is a strategic asset or a liability for the United States is a strong possibility. And a lot of that, again, I think does probably hinge on the Palestinian question and specifically Gaza, because members of Congress talk to regional leaders all the time. President Trump is certainly talking to regional leaders all the time, and they're going to look at what Israel has accomplished in the region and say, now it's time to deal with Gaza.
Thanks, Dana. That was really helpful. We're just about out of time, but Shira, I want to give you the last word and try and bring together a few questions that we've gotten from the audience in doing so. Looking ahead, I know we can't predict where Prime Minister Netanyahu goes, but we had one question referencing a Haaretz poll saying that 82% of Jewish Israelis back expelling Gazans. Do you expect that Prime Minister Netanyahu will use this in his favor, and that he might get Trump to bring back the Gaza Riviera plan as we think about, where do things in Gaza go? And we got a couple questions about the fate of the hostages and what is sort of the Israeli attention on the hostages amidst everything else going on. And then I would ask for you, where do you see all of this going, or what are you watching for in the coming weeks?
Okay, so just because we're at the top of the hour, I'll just be quick on this. When Trump, during Dana mentioned all this, on and off between Netanyahu and Trump over the last 5.5 months. The first visit right to the White House in early February, I remember looking back, I wrote an op-ed about this, and I remember saying just the illusion I'm reading of a permanent transfer of Gaza's population will remove the pressure of Israeli leadership to find a feasible plan for Gaza. And I did not know, I don't think any of us knew back then that this would, removing Gaza's Palestinian population, this sort of like voluntary migration, which is nice term for forced transfer, I couldn't imagine back then that it would be added to the goals of the war. And so if I were, and still, right, even I think yesterday or in the past couple of days, the prime minister himself or someone around the prime minister said we are going to solve the Gaza problem, bring the hostages back home, and fulfill President Trump's vision. So, Rachel, when you're speaking about him bringing back this vision, he hasn't spoken about it in a long time. And I think if there was one sort of policy recommendation for the people around him, if the president thinks now, and he's hearing from his partners in the region, that this is really not the best plan going forward. And this is not going to be good for stability in the region. It's really not feasible. And there's a face-saving way of saying this, right? I just threw this in as a negotiation plot, and the Arabs have come back with a counteroffer. I think that if the United States removes this plan as sort of from the menu, it'll be much harder for Israel to keep staving off the pressure and seeing this as sort of a lofty objective. And yeah, I think it's disturbing that the percentage of Israelis support it, right? Very high percentage of Israelis supporting it. It's not that I think, it's Hak Rabin himself used to say that it would be Israelis' lives would be easier if the Palestinians were not around, and vice versa, right? For the Palestinians, lives would be much easier if the Israelis were not around. But conversations that were a taboo before October 7 are no longer a taboo. It's wordsmithing, but it's something that I wish would change. But this is something that the fact that this sort of like is an illusionary plan that Trump still supports is basically removes the pressure from Israel to go in the direction that the president actually wants. And so I would advise to go in a different way. You asked me about, sorry, the other thing. Oh, the hostages. So we're talking about 50 hostages remaining in Gaza, but this count is misleading. We're talking about 20 who are believed to be alive. I mean, at this point, when we talk about a partial agreement and how do you select the first 10 if they are to be released based on humanitarian considerations after 627 days, and you hear the stories, I'm sure in the US, there's shackled, there's no one, if they're alive, they're barely alive, and just awful issue. This is an issue that does get still center stage in Israeli discourse and the population. And there are a lot of discussions on whether Netanyahu is going to use this achievement in Iran to call for snap elections. I actually don't think it's going to be a bad thing, because we've been saying all along, right, that this government lost its sort of like legitimacy after October 7, and they need to run for elections to receive the mandate, but also because we know that the hostages are a popular issue. 70% of Israelis want the hostages back home, even if it means ending the war. I suspect now the question about ending the war will get even like higher percentages, even disconnected from the hostages. But for Netanyahu, it would be wiser to run to elections with the hostages back home. And so I know it sounds cynical, it's not my calculation, but the fact is that if you look also at Gilad Shalit, who was released after 5 years in captivity, Netanyahu did it when it was politically convenient for him, even though the same exact terms of the deal were available 2 years before. I hope it will happen soon. It's a really complex issue, but I will just, to return to where we started, phenomenal military achievements after the worst, right, military failure. But Israel is running the longest war in its history in Gaza, a war that has no end in sight. And Netanyahu has now an incredible military legacy. And now it's time to anchor it with a diplomatic legacy, and he will need the help that he can get from President Trump.
Thank you, Shira. That is a perfect note to end on. I have failed in my role as timekeeper in that we have gone 6 minutes over, but I think for the sake of this conversation, it was worth it. Thank you both. This was tremendously valuable and interesting. I hope our listeners learned a lot. Thanks to our viewers for tuning in, and thanks to those who support Israel Policy Forum. For more analysis, to sign up for emails, webinar announcements, Israel Policy Podcast, and more, please visit our website at www.israelpolicyforum.org. Dana, Shira, thank you again.
Thank you.